Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon what part of the world you're joining us for this important conversation. I'm Steve Wernick, Rabbi Wernick, one of the rabbis of Beth Tzedec congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I am speaking today with my friend, Yossi Klein Halevi, author, journalist, thought leader on all matters Israel and the Jewish people, especially though the relationship of the diaspora and the Jews of the diaspora and Israel, and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that, as we all know, has recently resurfaced itself in a very hot way, causing a lot of damage, first and foremost for the people living in the region, but also I think an aftermath that continues to reverberate throughout the world. Especially, I know that we Jews around the world are feeling it in terms of an exponential rise of anti-Semitic activity as well. So we're really talking about Israel at this moment, and how we got here, where we are, and perhaps we can think together of where Israel and the Jewish people and Israel's neighbors, the Palestinians, might go into the future, so that we can break this cycle of violence and of destruction and despair, quite frankly. At least that's how I'm feeling right now. We invite you on Facebook and or YouTube to ask your questions in the chat, and we'll be able to get them to Yossi for a response. We are monitoring the chat, so if there's any anti-Semitic or inappropriate activity, we will be deleting that and blocking those users from our sites. So we just want everybody to know that. Yossi, always a pleasure to see you, even when we have to talk about even when we have to talk about heavy topics.
Yeah, it's always good to be with you, Steve, especially when we have to talk about heavy topics.
Right. Let's start from from the beginning, really. What are the circumstances and events that led to this latest war between Hamas and Israel?
I struggle with exactly that question. and I don't know really at what point to begin, how far back to go. So, for example, there are some who begin this conflict with the police decision to block the stairs at the Damascus Gate in the old city on Ramadan, for security reasons, for COVID reasons, for inexplicable reasons. Those stairs were always a gathering point for Palestinians, and now the police block them, and events seem to escalate from there. There are others who predate the chain of events to the famous or infamous TikTok slap. Do you know what I'm talking about, Steve?
No, actually, I don't. I know what TikTok is, but I don't know what the famous or infamous.
On the excuse me, on the Jerusalem light rail, there was an incident shortly before Ramadan of a Palestinian young man slapping two ultra-Orthodox Jews while his friend filmed it and then posted it on TikTok and got thousands of likes. And they were copycat slaps. And so groups of young Palestinian men began attacking Jews on the streets in Jerusalem. Jewish extremists began attacking Palestinians on the streets, and you had a little mini street war even before the police did their unnecessary, one could say even provocative action. How much that set the ground for what ended up escalating into an 11-day shooting war is an open question. But let's look at some of the more obvious reasons. One is something that, of course, has been in the media over and over again, which is the Sheikh Jarrah court decision to expel 6 Palestinian families from their homes in properties that once belonged to Jewish families. Now, I don't know how much you want to go into Sheikh Jarrah, but from my perspective, there are 3 elements in understanding Sheikh Jarrah. There is the legal, the political, and the moral. The legal issue is very straightforward. Those houses did belong to Jews before 1948. An Israeli court had no choice but to rule that those houses belonged to Jews. But the judge really did seem to bend over backwards to offer a fair solution. And he suggested to the Palestinians an arrangement of minimal rent in exchange for remaining in those houses in perpetuity, including for their children. Now, some Palestinian families accepted that arrangement. Most did not, because they insisted that they were the rightful owners. Now, that's the legal issue. It seems to me that on the legal level, Israel behaved honorably. On the political level, it starts to get more complicated. Because who brought this court case? Who brought the case to an Israeli court? It wasn't the families that owned these properties. It was a right-wing settler group that wanted to move Jewish families into a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. Now, Israeli governments, successive governments over the years were very reluctant about bringing this case to court. They never did. It was a far-right Jewish group that brought this case to court. Now, my question, as someone who lives literally 5 minutes away from Sheikh Jarrah and whose life has been upended by this far-right group, my driving route to work every morning was through Sheikh Jarrah. I can't go that way anymore. I've lost part of my city because of this right-wing organization. And so my question is, how do we allow a small group of far-right settlers to dominate the Israeli political agenda? So that's the political level. The moral level is even more problematic from an Israeli point of view. And that is that you can't have a situation where Jews can reclaim property that they lost in 48 and Palestinians can't. Now, I believe very strongly that we are perfectly within our rights to say no Palestinian reclamation of this property until there's a peace agreement. But what we need to do is freeze all claims, Jewish and Palestinian. And then when we come to the negotiating table, there will be many claims on the table, including the very extensive property claims of close to 1 million Jews who fled or were expelled from Arab countries. So there's lots of property claims here. There's no reason to allow a relatively small property claim of Jews from 1948 to so dominate the national agenda. So,
first of all, this is the reason why I love talking to you about these issues. You even anticipated one of my questions, which was the question about there's no Palestinian right for reclamation within, even for like maybe Israeli Arabs that were that moved as a result of one of the wars or so forth and so on. I appreciate that. How does this issue suddenly become, mass expulsion of Palestinians? How, that was shocking to me. How this particular claim, now suddenly, like what you hear in terms of the rhetoric, is we're talking about 48 again, and
that's nonsense. It's right. Nonsense. And what we did, frankly, was step in it. And we allowed ourselves to be set up in this way. We handed the enemies of Israel the perfect metaphor. And That's an act of stupidity that's unforgivable. When you're in the middle of a war, you need, and we are in the middle of a protracted war over the legitimacy of Israel, over the legitimacy of our story. You don't hand the other side the perfect metaphor. And especially when you are dealing with a story that's more complicated. And when you hear it played out that way, when you realize that, oh, wait a minute, the Israeli court actually offered a reasonable solution. It was a very minimal low rent. And the judge was really trying to avoid exactly this situation. And who knows what kind of pressure these families were under from the Palestinian Authority, frankly, to try to make of this a big political issue. And who knows, if there was money exchanged, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was. But all of that doesn't matter when you create a situation where you really don't have a whole lot to say, or alternatively, and this is just as bad, you have so much to say, you have such a long explanation that no one has patience to hear it.
And that gets me to this. I have this growing concern over the use of the word narrative. Are you worried that that narrative has taken over any sense of actuality?
A fact, yeah.
In fact,
Yeah, it's a tricky question for me personally, because as you know, I published a book a few years ago, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, whose premise is that Israelis and Palestinians need to start having a narrative conversation. And I believe that my story is not narrative. I believe that it's fact. But what I've learned by having this narrative conversation is that even when you agree on the facts, the interpretation, and very often we don't even agree on what happened or what's happening, even what's happening in the last few weeks, we can't agree on. Even in those in those instances where we can agree on, yes, this is actually what happened, the interpretations are so radically different on both sides that it's almost as if we're speaking about different facts. There's a problem that we have. We, the Israeli, the pro-Israeli side, in dealing with the Palestinian story, and that is that the Palestinian story can be summed up in 4 or 5 words. Very evocative words, especially in the current atmosphere. Right. Ethnic cleansing, apartheid, colonialism, occupation. Yeah. You've said those words and you've told the story. You're finished. On our side, we have a Jewish story. We said, well, in 1937, there was the Peel Commission, and we said yes, and they said no. And in 1947, and as soon as you talk about 1947 in the era of social media, you're finished. The Palestinian narrative, which is not a simplistic narrative, there's a history, there's a story, but it can be reduced to a few words. And when in the era of social media,
we're telling the Ganze Megillah and they're tweeting it.
Yeah, exactly. And when I wrote letters, I thought, wow, this is really an accomplishment. I was able to get our story down to 200 pages, and on the Palestinian side, they can do it in half a tweet. Right. And so, and that in the era of social media, look, I'm a writer. I don't know how to fight that kind of war. I really thought that the 200-page book is the what we used to call the Monarch Notes, the abbreviated version of the novel. But so that's the problem today of the narrative war.
Right. So I want to add a follow-up to that comes from Facebook. Somebody's asking the question about Jews having this conversation even amongst themselves. So one of the things that we've been seeing this trend for a while, but it's really come to the fore, I think, at this moment, and that is the divisiveness within the Jewish community, even as it relates to these narratives. What are your thoughts about that?
In some ways, I'm more worried about what's happening to us internally than I am externally. Externally, we are a people that's used to hatred. We're used to dealing with adversity. No naim, as we say in Hebrew, it's not pleasant, but we know how to deal with it. What we don't know how to deal with, because there's no way to deal with it, is fighting multiple wars simultaneously. How do you fight an external war against missiles, another external war against delegitimization, while you are increasingly divided internally? There's no way to win that kind of war. And I think we're going to need to figure out some way where we are able to have difficult emotional disagreements, but still agree on some broad consensus terms. It's not only in the issue of Israel that we're facing this breakdown of consensus. We're facing it on anti-Semitism. I don't know if this is as acute in Canada as it is in the US, but certainly in the US, Jews used to be able to agree on who is an anti-Semite. We were always divided on who is a Jew. That's the big, the coalition crisis in Israel. But we all knew who an anti-Semite was. We don't anymore. Is Linda Sarsour an anti-Semite, or is she a progressive ally? Is Steve Bannon an anti-Semite, or is he a right-wing ally? We have left-wingers who hate Israel but profess to love Jews. We have right-wingers who hate Jews but profess to love Israel. And so if you're left-wing, you'll say, well, Linda Sarsour is an ally. She doesn't hate Jews. She just hates us. Read Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times. We have to make a clear distinction between hating Israel, which is fine, which is morally necessary, but don't hate diaspora Jews. Don't take it out on the diaspora. Now, that seems to me a devil's bargain. And by the same token, I think Netanyahu made a devil's bargain when he embraced Hungary's Viktor Orban, who led an anti-Semitic campaign against George Soros, who I'm personally no fan of in terms of his as a Jewish role model. Nevertheless, you don't turn a Jewish billionaire into your country's archdemon, especially given Hungary's history, and then have the Prime Minister of Israel embrace you as an ally because Viktor Orban is pro-Israel. So what we're seeing is a breakdown of the most minimal consensus issues within the Jewish community. And again, it's not only Israel; it's at some level it's deeper than that. We can't even agree on who is part of the Jewish community anymore.
Right. You've been doing a lot of work with Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, Palestinian people with your book that you mentioned previously, but also just conversations. What are the lessons that you've learned from that you think could apply even to an intra-Jewish dialogue about these issues?
It's a really good question. As we all know from our own family dynamics, the closer and more intimate you get, the harder it can sometimes be. One of the difficulties we have with the Palestinians, with the Arab world, with the wider Muslim world, is that there is a certain intimacy. It's a pathological intimacy, but there really is. We are not distant, estranged enemies. We're intimate enemies. And
what do you mean by that?
We know each other. We're in each other's stories, and we're certainly in Muslim stories very strongly, whether Muslims always acknowledge it or not. And Muslims are very much in our story too over the last 2,000 years. deeply in our story. Much of it has been suppressed, but it's there. And the struggle over the land that we share is exactly that. It's this little piece of land, and we are fighting. Each side is fighting for dear life. Each side sees this legitimately from each side's perspective uh, as existential. And so this is a family. It's a family feud. And now it's cousins and not siblings. The Jewish feud is a feud of siblings, and I don't know which can be more damaging, because the feelings of betrayal are stronger the more intimate the family relationship. I don't have expectations of Palestinians. I certainly have expectations of diaspora Jews, and when those aren't met, when I get criticized and I'm fighting a war and missiles are falling on my cities, uh, and I'm being condemned by my fellow Jews abroad, I have very little patience for it. On the other hand, I really have to take a deep breath at those moments and say, well, how are they criticizing me? Why are they criticizing me? There's a difference between saying Israel has no right to exist, which is what an anti-Zionist Jew would say, between someone who loves Israel deeply and says, listen, you're losing the moral high ground, and I have to pay attention to that. If it's coming from that place of love, concern, and shared destiny. The anti-Zionist Jews are the evil son of the Haggadah in our generation. They're the apostates. They are right. They have written themselves out of our story, and I don't have a shared language with any Jew who will speak cavalierly of the destruction of Israel, of the disappearance of Israel. Just if only in the simple ground of protecting the world's largest Jewish community, 7 million Jews. Are you going to leave them effectively defenseless in one of the most dangerous regions in the world? Just on that level. But it's deeper than that. And it's deeper than that because anti-Zionist Jews are turning against the dream that sustained us as a people for 2,000 years, and then which unbelievably was fulfilled. If, God forbid, this dream unravels, then how do we pick up the pieces? This is what kept us going for 2,000 years. And then if we actually managed, under the most extraordinary circumstances, to fulfill that dream, and then it fails, what credibility do we as a people have anymore to ourselves? Where's the Jewish story after that? And so I really believe that that the future of the Jewish people depends very tangibly on the future of Israel. And anti-Zionist Jews who have joined the other side and are trying to effectively not just undermine, but really destroy the core of the Jewish story in our time, are, for me, are not part of my conversation anymore.
Wow. One of the complicating factors in this also seems to be the state of Israeli politics, which seems stuck in the mud itself. 4 elections in 3 years, probably a 5th. To what extent are we feeling the consequences of even an Israel that can't seem to figure out which direction it's going?
We are being held hostage. To some extent, we're being psychologically tortured by our prime minister. This is about one man who refuses to let go, who is holding the whole political system hostage. And look, he's also bringing out certain structural problems in the system. And sooner or later we would have had to confront either this way or another way some deep imbalances in the system. So I can't put all of this on him, but I think that this is a moment when what we're looking at is a very deep crisis in Israeli democracy and Israeli identity. Who are we? What is Israel? We used to take two things for granted. Israel is a Jewish state and Israel is a democratic state. And in the 80s and 90s, there was an attack from part of the Israeli elite, the secular elite, on the notion of Israel as a Jewish state. We saw it from the post-Zionists who were a fashion for a while. There were certain trends within the Israeli legal system that was trying to whittle away Israel's Jewishness. That's not a problem anymore. Israel as a Jewish identity is firmly established, both within the legal system and I would say within the consensus of the Israeli public. But Israel as a democracy is not firmly established, and I'm actually shocked by this. I have to admit to you. I moved to Israel in 1982 when Menachem Begin was the prime minister, the first right-wing prime minister in Israel's history. And Begin was, in some senses, the ultimate Democrat, the ultimate upholder of the integrity of the Israeli legal system. I remember there was a ruling against Begin's government by the Supreme Court over a settlement that was built on Arab land. The court ruled that Begin's government had to evacuate the settlement, and Begin's response was, Yesh shoftim b'Yerushalayim. There are judges in Jerusalem. That became an axiom in Israeli speech. It's part of our vernacular now. Yesh shoftim b'Yerushalayim. Go from Menachem Begin to Netanyahu, and I'll give you another example. When Meir Kahane, the far-right rabbi, was elected to the Knesset in 1984, Yitzhak Shamir was the prime minister. He succeeded Begin as head of the Likud, and if anything, he was even more right-wing than Begin. But every time Kahane would get up to speak in the Knesset, Shamir would lead the Likud delegation out of the hall in protest. Fast forward to the last election, when the head of the Likud, Netanyahu, was actively campaigning for Kahane's successors to enter into the Knesset because he wanted to make sure that their votes wouldn't be wasted for his coalition. Look where we've gone. Look how far we've gone. And so the crisis is much deeper than a structural crisis. It goes to the heart of our identity.
And that's where I think there's a legitimate linkage to the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, right? When you back to that political challenge that you mentioned when we were talking about that, when the leader of the government allows in the right-wing elements, that creates that context where people can easily fall off the deep end in terms of those accusations. That's very troubling as it relates to that. And I think part of the challenge too is Israel and much of the rest of the world. You talked about Hungary. I mean, we could go through a list of countries that are dealing with a right-wing resurgency in recent years. Israel is its politics has been swinging right, and North American Jewry politically has been swinging left.
Right.
And I'm going to disagree with you, or maybe not disagree, but just point out that the majority of North American Jewry hasn't really experienced the kind of anti-Semitism, of the past. It was born, I'm going to be 54. I was born in 1967. I've only known in Israel. That's been strong and powerful. And so, this gap between the diaspora experience and the Israeli experience are so vastly different now.
Yeah.
It just makes it more complicated and more disappointing when Israel's leaders don't seem to understand that.
Yeah, I know. It's not only that they don't understand it, it's worse than that. Some of them don't seem to care. And I think that that's true of Netanyahu. I don't think he really cares. His former ambassador to Washington was very explicit. Ron Dermer was very explicit.
Yeah.
He said we should be concentrating on the evangelicals and not worry about liberal American Jews. Now that's the destruction of the Jewish people. If that's your attitude, that you're going to go for short-term expedient allies and risk rupturing, a historic rupture with this second largest Jewish community in the world, North American Jewry, then what right do you have to speak in the name of the Jewish people? And so I look, I sit at the Hartman Institute, which in a way is the one of the bridges between Israel and liberal American Jewry. That's really become our function. It wasn't how we initially started out when David Hartman founded the Institute in the 1970s. I think he conceived of it very differently. It was really more going to be an institution that would be moving the Orthodox community, especially the Israeli Orthodox community, in a more flexible and liberal direction. Israeli Orthodoxy more or less repudiated Hartman, and so we became, over the years, a bridge. I would say, in some ways, the principal bridge for much of liberal American Jewry with Israeli society, and that's something I'm very proud of to be part of. So I'm sitting in a particular vantage point where I'm very sensitive to liberal American Jewish reactions, because that's my daily reality, even as I sit in Jerusalem. Most Israelis aren't exposed to that conversation. That's part of our failure. How is it possible that in the age of social media and globalization, we know less about each other maybe than ever before? That seems to me an extraordinary failure of Jewish leadership on all of our parts. And so that's, when we talk about diaspora-Israel relations, and again, I'm going to really speak more about North America, because in the end, what we're talking about is North American Jewry. European Jewry, as we all know, is in decline, and I don't know if European Jewry is going to survive this generation. We're now together, Israel and North American Jewry, we are over 90% of the Jewish people. And those numbers are only going to grow. So when we're talking about the future of the Jewish people, we're talking about the Israeli-North American Jewish relationship. Anyone who undermines that relationship, who doesn't actively nurture it, who doesn't place that relationship at the top of the Jewish people's agenda, is sinning against the future of the Jewish people.
So we have a question from Facebook related to this, which is not only those perspectives, as you said, sinning against Jewish people, but the question is, can you comment on the perspective that Israel's actions, Gaza, Sheikh Jarrah, Temple Mount security, settlement building, treatment of Arab Israeli citizens, so on, are endangering diaspora Jews, putting them at risk of experiencing hatred and violence? The question is, how should diaspora Jews feel in the face of this? I don't know if you should, if you should comment on that, but I think
it's an important question. I think two things need to be part of each other's conversations, internal conversations. In Israel, we need to be much more mindful of the consequences of our policies on diaspora security. And in the diaspora, and here again, I'm speaking more about American Jewry. I don't think it's as true for Canadian Jewry, although perhaps there are the beginnings of some signs of this there too. And that is a weakening of concern for Israeli security. I saw it in particular during the Iran deal debate in 2015, when a very large part of the community sided with President Obama against a virtual consensus within Israel that this deal is a terrible threat to our security. I consider that deal the single greatest threat to Israeli security probably since May 1967, since before the Six-Day War. And so we need to have these conversations. I have felt on the part of some diaspora Jews during this last war a lessening of concern for how Israelis experience living next door to Hamas and Hezbollah. I make a clear distinction. I was paying attention to the list of Israeli offenses, real or alleged, that you just read off. I would make a clear distinction between how Israel fought this war against Hamas with events on the Temple Mount, where I agree we used excessive force, especially during Ramadan, with Sheikh Jarrah, which again is more complicated than it's portrayed, but in the end should not have happened at all. And treatment of Arab Israelis is also a complicated story that really needs to be unpacked. We have to avoid these kind of simplistic litanies of Israeli offenses. But I make a clear distinction between everything that you cited and Israel fighting the war in Gaza. We had no choice but to fight the war in Gaza. And I think that given the constraints, given the circumstances of fighting against a terrorist group that is using its own civilian population as a cover from which or behind which to attack our civilians, we did as well as we could. And if we were acting in a reckless way, the casualty rates would have been exponentially higher. We were bombing Hamas facilities in crowded urban areas for 11 days. And most of the casualties were Hamas fighters. And for all of the heartbreak of each casualty, if you're looking at it in terms of military planning, in terms of military execution, in terms of Israel having the right to defend itself, I think we had no choice.
I was interviewed in the Toronto Star about that, and I was used as the foil in their article, where I basically said the same thing. It's like, a distinction has to be drawn between Hamas and the other issues. One can have legitimate questions and concerns over the policy decisions of the Israeli government, vis-a-vis its relationship with Israeli Arabs, as well as those that it is responsible for in the West Bank and its encounters with Gaza. But when Hamas fires rockets indiscriminately against its citizens and its cities, what choice does Israel have but to respond and to work to degrade their capabilities to do this again? I mean, nobody wants to come back and do this in 6 months or another year. You need to have some time to hopefully allow for other opportunities to develop. And then when you look at the fact that Israel had 1,500 targets, and the low number of casualties overall in the execution of those targets, you see that Israel, if anything, you talk about balance of power, Israel restrained its power, whereas Hamas just indiscriminately fired it. But yet I find myself, thinking, yeah, all of that is true, but it gets back to the original conversation we had before. It's like people aren't thinking about this reasonably or rationally. They're drawing a direct line from Sheikh Jarrah to Hamas, and how does Israel in all this suddenly become the bad guy for defending itself?
This is, we are facing a very complicated dilemma in the sense that every few years we have no choice but to fight a form of asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical warfare produces very difficult scenes. It pits a conventional army against an invisible opponent. The inevitable civilian casualties mount. Asymmetrical wars are very difficult to defend in the age of instant media. At the same time, that's not enough. We're also seemingly engaged in a permanent, open-ended occupation of the Palestinian people. So, if you're going to have moral credibility in fighting asymmetrical war, you have to make sure that you have moral credibility as a reluctant occupier. You cannot be perceived as pushing the Palestinians into a corner and not offering them an alternative. Now, when Ehud Barak accepted not one, but two plans in the year 2000 for a two-state solution, first at Camp David in July 2000, then President Clinton's proposal in December 2000, he gave the state of Israel an unimaginable gift. He gave us the gift of moral credibility. Because then when the second intifada came, right in the heels of Israel's acceptance and Arafat's rejection of not one, but two offers, two very credible offers for peace, we had the moral high ground. We could say, what do you want from us? Are we supposed to commit suicide? What alternative are the Palestinians giving us? And so we were able to shift the onus onto the Palestinians. Not for everybody. We still had lots of people around the world who blamed Israel no matter what, even during the Second Intifada. But at least most Jews, knew that we had tried. And then in 2009, Ehud Olmert renewed the two-state offer, and if anything, made an even more credible proposal. But we have not made a serious proposal since 2009. Now, do I really believe, as we say in Hebrew, Yad al Alev, honestly, do I really believe that if we were to say, okay, we're ready again, two states, East Jerusalem, Palestinian capital, we're going to dismantle settlements, go back to the 67 borders or the equivalent, but you have to give up the right of return. That's your big compromise. Do I believe that a Palestinian leader will step forward and say yes? I don't. But that doesn't absolve us either of the moral responsibility or of the strategic wisdom of making that offer. Every 5-10 years, we need to put a credible offer back on the table and test the waters. And then if there's a rejection, then okay, listen, I'm not going to mortgage my existence, my country's existence, to your leadership's rejectionism. But we have to keep testing that. And I understand Israelis who say, ad matai, until when? How many times do we have to keep putting an offer on the table? How many times do they have to keep saying no? And my answer is apparently we're not doing it enough times, because even within the Jewish people, we're starting to see serious strain. And we need to, at the very least, affirm our credibility for ourselves and our kids. And that's why we need a credible two-state offer to be put back on the table.
It's So I certainly accept and agree with that perspective personally. Yet at the same time, um, Mahmoud Abbas just canceled elections and he's starting his 17th year of his 4-year term. And the co-founder of Hamas appeared on, I think it was BBC yesterday, basically saying that Israel has no right to exist. So, I find myself echoing those Israelis to say ad matai, right? If we don't have partners, how do we do that, right? How do we do that where it doesn't seem like it's just where setting the Palestinians up for rejectionism so we can claim the high ground. I mean, what's the way in which that gets done from an authentic place of moral
I think
clarity?
that's a really important question. And I think what we need to do is more than just put the cold offer on the table. We need to be creating a whole infrastructure of obviously economic incentives, encouraging person-to-person meetings as much as possible. And I can tell you, as someone who's been involved in person-to-person meetings, it's getting harder and harder. Not among Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis. There, I would say we are entering into a period of urgent necessity, and I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of Arab-Jewish encounters within Israel proper. With Palestinians, it's getting much, much harder. I think that we need a different language. We need to be speaking to the Palestinians in a different way, not only in the language of security. And I emphasize the word only because we must speak in the language of security, but not only. We also need to begin developing a language of empathy, of moral concern. And I don't have to accept the Palestinian narrative or the Palestinian critique of Zionism to recognize that my return home helped shatter the Palestinians. I mean, ironically, in one way, it helped create their national identity, but in another way, we have shattered the Palestinian people. Now, it could have been different, and I certainly have no guilt for 1948. Most Israeli Jews do not. We don't feel guilty for having made an offer, a credible offer, accepting UN partition, and for surviving. We don't feel guilty for absorbing close to 1 million Jews from Arab countries. We don't feel guilty. We don't live with a sense of original sin. But that's different from saying, I don't care about the consequences of my homecoming, or I have no responsibility at all. Of course I have responsibility.
Or my concern for my security preempts any human concern I might have for the suffering of others.
I would say that's a really important point, Steve, because what I would say is my concern for my security is my first commitment. It's not my only commitment.
Right. It's possible to have an and in there, not a but.
That's right. That's right. And increasingly, Israelis are living the emotional consequences. Well, we're a PTSD society. And when you're living in the grips of PTSD, I have it too. I know I have it. I have it from the second Intifada. I have it from the first Intifada. And I know how it plays out. I recognize the signs by now. We as a society, it's true for the Palestinians, of course, and it's also true for us. We're in the grips of PTSD, and we're not quite normal. And so to expect moral complexity from either side is asking a lot. But for us, I can only speak for my side, and I will not absolve my side of the need to at least struggle with moral issues, to at least place moral considerations as a legitimate part of the Israeli conversation. And again, that was once taken for granted. Read the IDF Code of Ethics. Beautiful code. All right, it's hard to live up to. But I've been in conversations at Hartman. We've had extraordinary conversations. We had, after the last Gaza war, one of Israel's highest ranking officers, came for an off-record conversation where he poured his heart out about what it was like fighting that war, knowing he's fighting in civilian areas, doing his best, really trying, but saying, listen, what do I do in this situation? What do I do in that situation? And we had this extraordinary conversation. And it's those moments that really make me proud of Israel. We don't have enough of it these days. And we're losing our patience, because you need to keep reminding yourself that you have two responsibilities. You have the responsibility to be strong, and you have the responsibility of 4,000 years of Jewish history to answer to. And power and strength is essential, and I am endlessly grateful for living in the era of the rebirth of Jewish power, but that imposes responsibilities on you. And you can't have it both ways.
There are a number of questions that I'm seeing come in for you. Let me share some of them with you. Where are, the people are clearly gravitating to your voice. Where are those other leadership voices in government and outside of government? The kind of conversation that we're having now is unfortunately all too infrequent. So I think people are asking, are there others? Who are they? Where are they?
Well, look, I think that Yair Lapid, the head of the Yesh Atid party, There Is a Future, who is the head of the second largest party in Israel, head of the opposition, is a moral voice. He's careful. He doesn't want to be understandably dismissed by the right as naive, but he has a moral backbone, and he speaks about Israel's moral responsibilities. I have a great deal of appreciation for him as a leader. There are others in politics and certainly outside of politics. It's interesting. My book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is coming out in Hebrew. Unfortunately, it's coming out in the next few weeks. And I'm not looking forward to it, because this is the worst time to be coming out with a book that tries to model a respectful conversation between Israelis and Palestinians. The book ends, the paperback edition, which is what's being translated into Hebrew, ends with 50 pages of Palestinian responses to my letters. And I think it's a very moving document to see those 50 pages of Palestinian responses. But to have that come out now in Hebrew in Israel, when we're still reeling, and everyone, including myself, is furious at Hamas, the mistrust, unjustifiably, the mistrust against Palestinians is as high on our side as their justifiable mistrust from their side, from their end, is toward us. And so to have this book coming out now, it's not going to be a joyful publication release. It's really going to be a struggle, a fight, but it'll be interesting. And I think I'll be in a better position to answer this last question once the book comes out, and I can gauge just how difficult the responses are.
Or maybe Dafka, that's the book that we need now. Is to challenge us on that. A question from Rav Baruch Friedman Cole, who I know you know as well. And his question, images are more powerful and emotionally visceral than strategic analysis and explanation. This is the problem, of course, of centrists. How might journalism assist people to gain a broader perspective?
Well, Baruch, good to hear from you. Good to engage with you. I realize that I'm part of the last generation that was trained in the classical journalistic tradition. It's very painful for me to see where journalism has gone. It's very painful for me to see what the New York Times has become. The New York Times is not the same newspaper that I aspire to. I was so proud when I published my first op-ed in the Times 25 years ago. That was, for me, that was a pinnacle of journalistic achievement. And I look at how social media is replacing mainstream media and how mainstream media is becoming socialized media in tarte mashma, as we say. And it's so, this process is so painful to me. I think of the teachers that I had in journalism school. I went to really a classical training ground for journalism, and to Northwestern University near Chicago. And our teachers they saw journalism as the guardian angels of democracy. Journalists, you are not just entering into a profession. You are like the Supreme Court. You are the last defense of a free people. And
transparency and accountability. Right?
That's gone. That's gone. And one of the tragedies happened, and it happened in my generation of journalists, and I saw it happen when journalists began confusing their mission or shifting their mission from the search for truth to the search for justice. Now, the search for truth is an impossible quest. You never find absolute truth in this world, but you can find an approximation. And the quest for truth has its own integrity, has its own urgency. As soon as you give up the quest for truth and you're now engaged in a quest for justice, you have entirely embraced the subjective perspective. Because one person's justice, as we know very well in the issue we're discussing today, one person's justice is another person's crime. And the job of journalists is not to search for justice. If you're looking for justice, become a philosopher, become a political activist. Do not confuse journalism with that. So, Baruch, if you're asking me, what should journalism be doing today? Journalism should be journalism. Do I think that that's really going to happen? As we say in the Middle East, Elohim Gadol. God is great.
God is great. Last question, Yossi, and thank you so much for this. A lot of people are wondering, what's my role in all this? What is it that I, as an individual, can do to help ameliorate these circumstances, and to hopefully, try to make the world a little better?
So I really appreciate the question, and I think that each of us, as individuals, those of you who are listening who are part of the Jewish community, I imagine most people listening are part of the community. I think that we need to be holding multiple commitments simultaneously, and it's very difficult because in the prevailing culture, the tendency is to simplify. You hold one commitment to the exclusion of all other commitments. And I think that that's a deeply un-Jewish place. I think a Jewish place demands complexity, even contradiction. To hold a Jewish place is to hold a hard place, a messy place. And so for me, I can just play out for you what my commitments are. My first commitment, the ground on which I stand, the ground that makes all of my other commitments possible, is a strong and healthy and vibrant Jewish people. Healthy, vibrant, first of all, physically, to be able to protect ourselves. And then, for me, healthy, morally, spiritually. In the end, that's no less important, but in my order of priorities, making sure that we can protect ourselves from
Lo
missiles.
hametim tahalelia, right? Is
No
the
Hamesim
dead don't,
Halelia.
yeah,
That's right.
right? Right?
Exactly.
The dead don't worship God. So
Yes. So my first priority is to make sure that I'm not dead. Then then that I am in a place where I really can worship God, where I'm right enough in myself that God won't reject my prayers. So what does that mean in practice? Look, my own commitment, more and more in recent years, has been to engage with Palestinians, and this book that I wrote was really for me a gift because look, I'm a writer. I don't know how to do anything else. I don't know how to do this in any other way, and so I work with language, and this book gave me a language and in effect a pretext to reach out to Palestinians and to make Palestinian friends and relationships and to create a space where we can start having these conversations about our story, where our story can be heard, and where we listen to their stories. And that's I deal with stories. That's my trade. And so each of us, from wherever our place is, needs to figure out how do we engage the other, who is the other, but only from a place of Jewish strength. And by that, I mean Jewish self-confidence in our story. We don't have to accept every Israeli government decision in order to be secure in our Jewish story, in our love for the Israeli story. And I see too many Jews in the diaspora wavering when they find themselves challenged by Israeli government policies. I don't understand that. It does. Why should that work? I mean, America, the U.S. has just been through 4 traumatic years of a nightmare leadership. I don't know any American Jews who questioned their love and loyalty to the United States.
I
So
think it has to do with term limits.
yeah, I will agree with that. So that's a really good point. So I think that we need to, from a place of Jewish self-confidence, to engage with in whatever way is possible. Look, I was part of a meeting, an off-the-record meeting in Toronto a few years ago of a group of Muslim community leaders and Jewish community leaders. This goes back, 2, 3 years. And it was an extraordinary encounter. It was very difficult. But these are people who've never been around the table together before. And we met in the home of a prominent Muslim community leader who kashered his home for this dinner. That was the level of hospitality that he extended to us. And again, the conversation was not easy, but something really powerful happened around that table. I'm committed to being in those conversations, in conversation with any Muslim, any Palestinian who will be in conversation with me. And I'm ready to hear anything. And believe me, I've heard everything. I've heard the whole range. I have heard everything from Holocaust denial to Temple Mount denial. I've heard the whole range. And I'm ready to sit there and listen if you, my interlocutor, are also ready to listen to what I have to say. That's my commitment.
With that, I'll just end by noting that the word Yisrael for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel is the one who wrestles with God and humanity and prevails. Clearly, we're still in the ring. We're still tossing each other around.
Yeah.
And that perhaps is the burden of the Jewish people, is the celestial wrestling match that never ends. But God willing, we'll come to a point where there can be not only shalom, but shlemut.
Amen.
Yossi, thank you so much for always being available to us in the diaspora and to Israelis and to Palestinians, to Muslims, to anybody who's willing to have a really thoughtful, a deep conversation with you about these very, very complex issues.
Well,
I know.
thank you, Steve. I really thank you, first of all, for decades of friendship and for your leadership. And I'm so grateful to you for these conversations that you and I have had over the years. And God willing, we'll continue to talk about Jewish problems.
Yeah. And I was going to say, maybe as COVID begins to lift, we'll be able to find a way for you to come and visit with us. We'll continue the conversation.
I would love to come back to Beth Tzedec. So thank you.
Want to just remind everyone who's watching that at Beth Tzedec, we inspire and enable our community to live a meaningful Jewish life. Conversations such as these that challenge us are part and parcel of that inspiration for a meaningful Jewish life. Be sure to check out our website, www.beth-tzedec.org, for all the other opportunities by which you can engage with us religiously, spiritually, culturally, educationally, celebratorily, and in our pursuit of social justice as well. Thank you, Yossi, for being with us. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Bye.